January 17, 1944, on the freezing banks of the Garigliano River, the first artillery shells scream toward the heights at 9 p.m. as the Allied command initiates an offensive they believe will finally open the gates to Rome. To the men shivering in the foxholes of the Liri Valley, the Italian campaign has long since lost the luster of a liberation march. What was once described by Winston Churchill as the soft underbelly of the Axis has hardened into a jagged, frozen spine of limestone and misery. The Allies find themselves staring up at a wall of stone known as the Gustav Line, a masterpiece of defensive engineering stretching from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic. At its center, anchoring the entire German position, stands the town of Cassino and the towering heights of Monte Cassino, topped by the ancient Benedictine Abbey. The sun begins to rise over the jagged peaks at 7:15 a.m. the following morning, revealing a landscape that favors the defer in every conceivable way. The Liri Valley is the only viable path for tanks and heavy equipment to reach Rome. But that path is narrow and flanked by mountains that act as natural fortresses. The Germans, led by the tactical brilliance of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, have spent months turning these peaks into a nightmare. They have cleared every tree that might offer cover, sighted every inch of the valley for artillery, and blasted bunkers directly into the mountainside. The German 10th Army, bolstered by the elite paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, waits in silence, watching every movement from above. For the Allied soldiers of the US 5th Army and the British 8th Army, the feeling of being watched is omnipresent. High above them, the Abbey of Monte Cassino sits like a silent white sentinel. Though the Germans initially promised to respect the sanctity of the monastery and leave it unoccupied, the Allied commanders are convinced it is being used as a primary observation post. From those heights, a German spotter can see a single Allied soldier lighting a cigarette miles away. This psychological weight is crushing. By 11 a.m. on that first day of the assault, the British 5th and 56th Divisions find themselves entangled in a web of minefields and pre-registered mortar fire that turns the river crossing into a slaughterhouse. The geography of the region creates a strategic impasse that the Allied High Command is slow to reconcile. To the west, the Tyrrhenian marshes are flooded, and to the east, the Apennines are impassable for armor. This leaves the Rapido River, a fast-flowing, deep obstacle that runs right through the mouth of the Liri Valley. When the American 36th Infantry Division attempts to cross this river at 8 p.m. a few days later, they are met with a wall of steel. The boats are shredded by machine gun fire before they even touch the water. Men drown under the weight of their packs, and those who make it to the other side find themselves pinned against the riverbank with no hope of reinforcement. By 3:30 p.m. the next afternoon, it becomes clear that the first assault has failed. The cost is a staggering reminder that the Gustav Line is not a mere hurdle, but a fortress that requires more than just bravery to break. The impasse at Cassino begins to take on a grim, symbolic importance. It is no longer just about a road to Rome. It is about the collision of two stubborn ideologies in a landscape that seems to reject the very presence of modern machinery. The mud of Italy is a thick, clutching sludge that swallows tanks whole, and the winter wind carries the scent of cordite and decay. As the first assault grinds to a halt, the legacy of Monte Cassino begins to take root in the minds of those who survive. This was the moment the Allies realized that the Mediterranean theater would not be a swift victory, but a grueling war of attrition. The impasse at the Gustav Line represents the tragic irony of war, where a place of ancient peace and spiritual refuge is transformed into the most dangerous ground on earth. The mountains do not care for the politics of men, and the abbey, standing defiant against the grey sky, becomes a symbol of the immense cost of human ambition. The struggle for Cassino would eventually claim 55,000 lives, proving that even in the modern age, the primitive strength of the earth and the heights can hold back the might of empires. This initial failure was merely the prologue to a 5-month ordeal that would leave the monastery in ruins and the valley a graveyard, reminding us that some victories are so costly they are indistinguishable from defeat. January 20, 1944, along the banks of the Rapido River in central Italy. A cold mist clung to the freezing water as the men of the United States 36th Infantry Division prepared for what would become one of the most controversial and bloody engagements of the entire campaign. The Rapido was not a wide river, but it was swift, deep, and treacherous, acting as a natural moat protecting the entrance to the Liri Valley and the road to Rome. General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army, was under immense pressure to break through the Gustav line to link up with the planned landings at Anzio. He believed a direct frontal assault across the Rapido was the only way to pin down German forces and force a gap in their formidable defenses. However, the German 15th Panzer Grenadier Division held the high ground on the opposite bank, their machine gun nests, mortars, and artillery pre-registered on every square inch of the crossing sites. At 8 p.m. on that first night, the soldiers of the 36th Division, many of them from the Texas National Guard, began their move toward the river. They carried heavy wooden assault boats through uncleared minefields and thick mud. The silence of the night shattered by the sudden and violent roar of German flares. The valley was instantly illuminated, turning the riverbank into a stage where the American soldiers were the primary targets. German artillery opened up with devastating precision. The Rapido quickly turned into a scene of absolute carnage as boats were splintered by shells and men were thrown into the icy, churning water. Weighed down by their heavy winter gear and ammunition, many drowned before they could even reach the far bank. Those few who did manage to cross found themselves isolated, pinned down against a wall of German fire with no way to receive reinforcements or supplies. By 7 a.m. the following morning, the first attempt had collapsed into a chaotic retreat. The survivors who made it back to the Allied side were exhausted and shell-shocked, but the command was relentless. Despite the clear evidence that the German positions were untouched and the river was a death trap, the order was given to strike again. On January 21 at 4 p.m., the second wave was sent into the meat grinder. This time, the German defense was even more prepared. The smoke screens intended to mask the American advance were dissipated by the wind, leaving the infantry completely exposed. Under the relentless hammering of the German MG-42 machine guns, the 141st and 143rd Infantry Regiments were decimated. By 2 p.m. the following day, the 36th Division had effectively ceased to exist as a functional offensive unit. In just 48 hours, over 2,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured, and the Rapido ran red with the blood of the Texas Division. While the disaster at the Rapido unfolded, the French Expeditionary Corps to the north was engaged in its own brutal struggle. Led by General Alphonse Juin, the French and their Maroc Goumier units were tasked with capturing the high peaks of Monte Belvedere and Col Abate. These men were masters of mountain warfare, but the terrain was so steep and rugged that every scrap of food and every crate of ammunition had to be carried up the slopes on the backs of mules or the men themselves. They fought through blizzards and over sheer rock faces, often engaging in hand-to-hand combat with German mountain troops. While they achieved some tactical successes, the cost was staggering, and they lacked the reserves to exploit the small breaches they made in the German line. Simultaneously, the British 10th Corps attempted a crossing of the lower Garigliano River. They managed to establish a bridgehead and capture several key hills, but the German commander, Albert Kesselring, moved his reinforcements with calculated efficiency to plug the gaps. The British found themselves stuck in a war of attrition, holding onto muddy ridges under constant shelling. Every yard of Italian soil was being purchased with the lives of young men from across the globe. Yet the heart of the Gustav line remained unbroken. As January drew to a close, it became clear that the first assault had failed to achieve its primary objectives. The Allies had severely underestimated the German resolve and the tactical brilliance of the defenses built into the landscape itself. The German bunkers were not merely holes in the ground. They were steel-reinforced fortresses carved into the ancient rock, capable of withstanding the heaviest Allied naval and air bombardments. When the shelling stopped, the German paratroopers would emerge, man their weapons, and wait for the infantry to come into range. The tragedy of this first phase lies in the realization that these sacrifices were only the beginning. The men who survived the Rapido and the surrounding peaks looked up at the massive, silent shadow of the Benedictine monastery on Monte Cassino and saw a fortress that seemed to mock their efforts. The failure of these initial breakthroughs set a grim tone for the months to follow, proving that the road to Rome would be paved with the bodies of those who tried to storm the heights. It serves as a poignant reminder that in the face of such formidable geography and entrenched will, bravery alone is often not enough. The legacy of the first assault is one of bitter lessons, learned at a price no army should have to pay, leaving a silence in the Liri Valley that echoes the voices of the thousands who fell before the walls of Cassino ever crumbled. February 11, 1944, at the base of the Aranci Mountains, the winter chill bit through the wool uniforms of the newly arrived New Zealand and Indian divisions. The failure of the first assault had left the Allied High Command desperate for a breakthrough, and the shadow of the Monte Cassino Abbey loomed larger than ever over the freezing soldiers below. To the men huddling in the mud of the Liri Valley, it felt as though every movement they made was being watched by an unseen, omniscient eye from the Benedictine monastery perched high above. General Bernard Freyberg, commanding the New Zealand Corps, became convinced that the historic structure was being used as a German observation post. While the Vatican had received assurances from the German High Command that no soldiers were inside the walls, the tactical reality on the ground told a different story to the officers staring up at those white stone ramparts. They believed no army would leave such a perfect vantage point empty, and as long as the abbey stood, the road to Rome remained padlocked. The debate over whether to destroy one of Christianity's most sacred sites reached the highest levels of Allied leadership. General Mark Clark was deeply hesitant, fearing the historical and moral backlash that would follow the destruction of a 1400-year-old treasure. But the pressure from the front lines was overwhelming. If the abbey was helping the Germans kill Allied soldiers, then the abbey had to go. By the morning of February 15, the decision had been finalized under the grim justification of military necessity. At 9:45 a.m., the first wave of American B-17 flying fortresses appeared in the clear blue sky, their silver wings glinting in the winter sun. For the soldiers watching from the valley, it was a sight of both awe and profound terror. Over the next few hours, more than 400 tons of high explosives rained down on the hilltop in a relentless cacophony of fire and stone. By 2 p.m., the magnificent structure, which had stood as a beacon of learning and peace for over a millennium, was reduced to a jagged mountain of white dust and broken masonry. The smoke rose thousands of feet into the air, a funeral pyre for centuries of art, literature, and architecture. Yet, as the dust settled, the grim irony of the situation began to reveal itself to the horrified Allied planners. The bombing had not cleared the way for the infantry. Instead, it had created the perfect defensive position. The elite German paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Division, who had indeed respected the neutral zone of the abbey before the bombing, now felt no such obligation. They moved into the shattered ruins, finding that the thick, collapsed walls and deep subterranean cellars provided far better protection against artillery than the original standing building ever could. The rubble became a fortress of jagged craters and hidden nests. The second assault, known as Operation Avenger, was launched into this nightmare landscape. On the night of February 17, the Royal Sussex Regiment attempted to take Snake's Head Ridge, while the 4th Indian Division struggled through the treacherous, rocky terrain toward the monastery ruins. At 3:15 a.m., the silence of the night was shattered by German machine gun fire that seemed to come from every crevice of the broken mountain. The Indian troops, many of whom were veterans of desert warfare, found themselves in a vertical slaughterhouse. They were forced to climb near vertical slopes under a hail of grenades and mortar shells that they could not see or return fire against. Meanwhile, the New Zealanders fought a brutal house-to-house battle in the town of Cassino itself, trying to seize the railway station to open a path for the tanks. The fighting was primal, often reduced to bayonets and grenades in the basements of ruined villas. By 4 p.m. the following day, it was clear that the second assault had failed just as bloodily as the first. The bombing of the abbey had been a tactical catastrophe disguised as a psychological necessity. It had achieved nothing but the destruction of a cultural treasure and the transformation of a monument into a slaughterhouse. The ruins of Monte Cassino became a symbol of the futility that defined the Italian campaign. It stands as a haunting testament to the desperation of total war, where the preservation of human heritage is often sacrificed at the altar of perceived military advantage. The tragedy was not just in the loss of the stones and the frescoes, but in the realization that the sacrifice did not save a single Allied life. In fact, it likely cost thousands more. The broken monastery remained a silent witness to the carnage, its hollowed-out windows staring down like empty eye sockets at the valley of the shadow of death. This second failure proved that the mountain would not be taken by fire from the sky or by the sheer grit of the infantry alone. It would require a transformation of the very soul of the army and a willingness to endure even greater horrors before the heights could finally be won. The legacy of the ruins is a poignant reminder that in war, the pursuit of a shortcut often leads to a much longer and bloodier road, where the ghosts of the past and the victims of the present are buried under the same weight of rubble. March 15, 1944. The valley below the ancient ruins of Monte Cassino witnessed a spectacle of destruction that few soldiers in the history of warfare had ever survived. After 2 failed attempts to break the winter line, the Allied command decided to unleash the full weight of their air power in a bid to pulverize the German defers into submission. This was Operation Dickens, a plan born of frustration and a desperate need to reach Rome before the summer heat. The strategy was deceptively simple. They would level the town of Cassino with a concentrated aerial bombardment so intense that no living soul could possibly offer resistance. The bombardment began at 8:30 a.m. For the next 3.5 hours, nearly 500 heavy and medium bombers circled over the tiny Italian town, dropping more than 1,000 tons of high explosives. From the surrounding hills, Allied soldiers watched in awe as the town was swallowed by a gargantuan cloud of dust and smoke that rose thousands of feet into the air. By noon, when the last of the bombers turned back toward their bases, the town of Cassino had effectively ceased to exist. It was no longer a collection of streets, shops, and homes, but a jagged, lunar landscape of grey dust and pulverized stone. The Allied commanders were confident. They believed the infantry would simply have to walk through the debris to occupy the vacant ruins and clear the way for the tanks. But as the artillery took over at 12:30 p.m., laying down a creeping barrage to cover the advance, the true horror of the situation began to emerge. The very bombs meant to clear the path had created a nightmare of impassable craters some 30 feet deep and mountains of masonry that blocked every single street. The Allied tanks, intended to provide the muscle for the breakthrough, found themselves instantly bogged down in the churned earth or trapped behind walls of rubble that no bulldozer could clear in time. More terrifying still was the resilience of the defers. Deep within the cellars and reinforced bunkers of the town, the German 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had waited out the storm. These were the Green Devils, arguably the finest infantrymen in the German army. As the bombing ceased at 1 p.m., they crawled out from the smoking craters, shook the dust from their uniforms, and manned their MG-42 machine guns. They did not retreat. Instead, They used the very ruins created by the Allies as a ready-made fortress. Every pile of bricks became a sniper's nest, every flooded cellar became a pillbox. The New Zealanders of the 2nd Division and the Indian troops of the 4th Division pushed into the town only to be met with a wall of lead. The combat that followed was some of the most savage and intimate of the entire Second World War. It was a battle of inches, fought with grenades, knives, and submachine guns in the pitch-black darkness of ruined buildings. At the Hotel des Goths and the Continental Hotel, the fighting moved room to room and floor to floor. Men threw grenades up staircases they could not see and fired through floorboards at shadows moving below. By the evening of the first day, the weather turned, adding another layer of misery to the carnage. A torrential downpour began, turning the thick dust into a suffocating slurry of mud. The craters filled with freezing water, and the town became a swamp of debris and death. On the heights above, the Indian paratroopers managed to seize a precarious position known as Hangman's Hill, but they were soon cut off from all supplies. For days, they survived on the meager rations dropped by aircraft, huddled in the rocks under the constant gaze of the German observers in the monastery ruins above. The third assault eventually ground to a halt on March 23. The Allied leadership finally accepted that the town could not be taken by head-on attrition. The cost had been staggering, with thousands of casualties for the gain of a few hundred yards of shattered stone. The failure of Operation Dickens proved that sheer firepower could not replace the tactical necessity of outflanking a determined enemy. The legacy of the third assault at Cassino is one of grim urence and the terrifying realization that modern technology can create environments where human bravery is reared almost moot. The town did not become a gateway to Rome. It became a tomb for the young men of a dozen nations. It stands as a reminder that in the face of total destruction, the human spirit, even when directed toward the most violent can survive the impossible. The ruins of Cassino were not just a physical obstacle, but a psychological weight that forced the Allies to rethink the very nature of the Italian campaign. It taught a bitter lesson that would be remembered long after the guns fell silent, that the pursuit of a decisive blow often leads only to a deeper, more agonizing stalemate in the mud and the blood of the valley floor. May 11, 1944, along the banks of the Garigliano and Gari rivers, the oppressive silence of the Liri Valley was shattered by the roar of 1,600 Allied artillery pieces. This was the commencement of Operation Diadem, a massive, multinational effort designed to finally break the back of the Gustav line and clear the road to Rome. General Harold Alexander had spent weeks meticulously shifting his forces in total secrecy, moving the bulk of the British 8th Army from the Adriatic coast to the Cassino front, achieving a local superiority that the Germans, bled white by months of static warfare, could no longer match. At 11 p.m., the sky turned a bruised purple as thousands of shells rained down on German positions, signaling that the fourth and final act of this long-running tragedy had begun. While the British and Americans pushed across the rivers in the valley floor, a critical breakthrough occurred where the Germans least expected it. The French Expeditionary Corps, led by General Alphonse Juin and including thousands of Moroccan Goumiers, launched an audacious assault through the supposedly impassable Oronsi Mountains. By traversing the rocky crags and steep ridges that the Wehrmacht believed provided a natural shield, the French troops successfully outflanked the German 10th Army, threatening to cut off their primary line of retreat along Highway 6. This maneuver turned the tide of the entire campaign, but the most symbolic and brutal struggle was reserved for the heights overlooking the valley, where the Polish II Corps under General Władysław Anders prepared to assault the ruins of the abbey once more. For the Polish soldiers, many of whom had survived the horrors of Soviet gulags and traveled thousands of miles just for the chance to fight, this was more than a strategic objective. It was a matter of national honor and a desperate bid to prove their worth to an Allied command that was already negotiating the future of their homeland behind closed doors. On the morning of May 12, the Polish infantry moved against the infamous Phantom Ridge and Hill 593. The fighting was savage and intimate, often devolving into primitive brawls with grenades, bayonets, and knives amidst the jagged, blood-slicked rocks. The German 1st Parachute Division, the Leggery Green Devils, fought with a fanatical tenacity that seemed to defy the reality of their situation, turning every crater and basement into a miniature fortress. The first Polish assault was repulsed with staggering losses, but Anders would not yield. He knew that the eyes of the world were on his men, and that their sacrifice was the only currency they had left. By May 17, the cumulative pressure from the French breakthrough in the south and the relentless, grinding Polish pressure on the northern heights began to buckle the German defenses. Field Marshal Kesselring, realizing his forces faced imminent encirclement, finally authorized a fighting withdrawal. Under the cover of darkness, the remaining survivors of the Parachute Division slipped away into the mountains, leaving behind a charnel house of stone and shadow. At 10:20 a.m. on May 18, 1944, a patrol from the 12th Podolian Ulan Regiment finally reached the jagged ruins of the monastery. They found only the dead and a handful of wounded who were too mangled to move. A makeshift Polish flag, followed soon by the Union Jack, was hoisted over the debris. The fall of Monte Cassino was a victory, but it was a victory draped in black. The four battles had claimed over 55,000 Allied casualties and approximately 20,000 German lives, a toll that remains one of the most lopsided and horrific of the Western Front. While the road to Rome was finally open and the Eternal City would fall just weeks later, the strategic significance of the breakthrough was almost immediately overshadowed by the massive landings in Normandy. For many who fought there, Cassino became a forgotten slaughterhouse, a place where the brilliance of high-ranking generals was ground into the dirt by the stubbornness of the terrain and the sheer, unyielding endurance of the common soldier. Today, the rebuilt abbey stands as a silent sentinel over the Liri Valley, its pristine white walls masking the deep scars of a mountain that was once saturated with the blood of 20 different nations. At the Polish cemetery nearby, a poignant inscription serves as a permanent reminder of the stakes involved. We Polish soldiers, for our liberty and yours, have given our souls to God, our bodies to the soil of Italy, and our hearts to Poland. It is a reflection of the bitter truth that the cost of breaking a stalemate is measured not in miles gained or hills taken, but in the generational void left behind by those who never came home. Monte Cassino remains a testament to the fact that while war can destroy the grandest monuments of faith and history, it can never fully extinguish the dignity of those tasked with the impossible, even when the price of success is almost too high for the living to bear. May 19, 1944, on the jagged, blood-soaked slopes of Monte Cassino, the guns finally fell silent. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of exhaustion, a heavy stillness that sat over a landscape transformed into a lunar wasteland. For 4 months, this single mountain and the ancient monastery crowning its peak had served as a meat grinder for the youth of a dozen nations. When the dust settled, the Allied victory was not a moment of jubilant triumph, but a somber realization of the sheer scale of the sacrifice required to break the Gustav line. The capture of the ruins by the Polish Second Corps was a symbolic victory. Yet it was bought with a currency of human life that few could have imagined when the campaign began in the freezing rains of January. They called it a grave of nations, and the cemeteries surrounding the mountain today serve as a silent, eternal roll call. Here lie the British and the Americans, the Indians and the New Zealanders, the French colonial troops from North Africa, and the Poles who fought for a home they would never see again. Even the German paratroopers, who held these heights with a terrifying and stubborn tenacity, left thousands of their own in the shadow of the monastery. It is a landscape defined by names carved in white stone, representing 55,000 lives extinguished in a struggle for a few square miles of Italian soil. Strategically, The Battle of Monte Cassino remains one of the most fiercely debated chapters of the Second World War. Historians still ask if the frontal assaults were truly necessary, or if the sheer weight of the Allied war machine could have bypassed this natural fortress. The decision to bomb the abbey on February 15 at 9:30 a.m. remains a permanent scar on the conscience of the Allied High Command. Instead of forcing a German retreat, the destruction of the historic structure created a labyrinth of jagged rubble that only served to strengthen the German defense. It was a tragedy of errors, where the cultural heritage of centuries was traded for a tactical advantage that never actually materialized. Beyond the maps and the grand movements of divisions, the true legacy of Cassino is found in the individual stories of human endurance. It was a battle of the soul as much as the body. Soldiers lived in frozen foxholes during weeks of relentless shelling and the constant, gnawing fear of a sniper's bullet from the heights above. The mountain was an indifferent observer to their misery, a monolith of limestone that seemed to mock the mortality of the men crawling up its sides. When the red and white flag finally fluttered over the ruins on the morning of May 18 at 10:20 a.m., it marked the end of the siege. But it was only the beginning of a long journey of remembrance for the survivors who would carry the shadows of Cassino for the rest of their lives. For the Polish soldiers, Cassino was their epic. They fought with the desperation of men who had lost everything but their honor. Their cemetery, nestled between Hill 593 and the Abbey, contains the remains of over 1,000 men who died to prove to the world that Poland had not yet perished. The inscription there serves as perhaps the most poignant summary of the entire campaign, reminding us that they gave their souls to God, their bodies to the soil of Italy, and their hearts to their homeland. It is a sentiment that transcends nationality, speaking to the universal tragedy of the common soldier caught in the gears of total war. Today, the Abbey of Monte Cassino stands rebuilt, its white walls gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, as if the fires of 1944 were merely a bad dream. But the earth beneath it remembers. The hills are still scarred by the remnants of trenches and the craters of 1,000-pound bombs. The reconstruction of the monastery was a message that civilization can endure, but the cost of that endurance is etched into the casualty lists that haunt the archives of London, Washington, and Warsaw. As we look back on those 4 brutal assaults, we are forced to confront the bitter reality that history is often written in the blood of those who had no choice but to follow orders. Monte Cassino was not just a strategic objective. It was a testament to the heights of human bravery and the depths of military folly. It reminds us that victory is often indistinguishable from catastrophe, and that the true measure of a battle is found not in the flags raised, but in the silence of the cemeteries that remain. The mountain stands as a permanent monument to the heavy price of freedom, a reminder that while the stones may be replaced, the lives lost are gone forever. The victory at Cassino was a victory of the spirit, but it was a spirit forged in a fire that should never have been lit.